My dad was his parents' only son. Tall but not physically imposing, he dreamed of being on television, having a voice that made an impact. Armed with an insatiable desire to succeed and aided by his natural gifts, which included a deeply resonant voice, he made his dream come true soon after finishing up at Bard College in 1971. As a young reporter, he went to many corners of the country, following a story or, in many cases, following a job. After stints in North Carolina, New York, Florida, Virginia, California, and a handful of other states, he returned home to Southern Maryland and started work at a job that would change his life. He finally had the chance to host his own public affairs show, and he'd hired a new writing assistant. Her name was Joy. Their working relationship evolved quickly into courtship and then love. She appreciated this up and coming reporter and the professional partnership they shared. Wes was calm, reassuring, hardworking, and sober. In other words, the antithesis of Bill. Wes was intensely attracted to this short woman with a broad smile who mixed a steel backbone with Caribbean charm. And he loved Nikki. Despite her not being his own child, he forged a sincere friendship and eventually an unbreakable bond with Nikki. It all became official when my mother and father married in a small ceremony in Washington, D.C. I entered the world 2 years later. On April 15th, 1982, my father ended his radio news broadcast on WMAL, a stalwart in the Washington, D.C. market, with his traditional sign off, "This is Westmore, thanks again, and we'll talk next time." As the on air light faded to black, his smile was hiding the fact that for the past 12 hours he'd been feeling ill. His every breath was a struggle. He came home to the smell of his favorite meal, smothered lamb chops. It was almost midnight, and we kids were already in bed. But my parents stayed up, sat together, and ate. That night, they couldn't get to sleep. He tried taking Tylenol, hoping that it would help his severe sore throat and fever, but the pill lodged in his throat, refusing to dissolve. At 7 a.m., he woke up my mother to tell her that he thought that he should go to the hospital. He threw on a tattered blue flannel shirt and a pair of worn blue jeans. He got in his red Volkswagen Rabbit and drove himself to the hospital. After my mother took Nikki to school and dropped Shani and me off with the babysitter, she rushed to meet my father. In the emergency room, she was shocked by the disoriented man before her. My father could not keep his eyes open. His head flopped from side to side. The doctors thought the cause of discomfort was a sore throat and blamed his lack of neck control on the lack of sleep. To reduce the pain, they anesthetized his throat. In retrospect, that was the worst thing that they could have done. He could no longer feel it closing. The doctors didn't know what to make of his symptoms. They questioned my mother about my father's medical history and then shifted to questions about his mental state. Does he have a habit of exaggerating? Is there anything going on in life that would force him to make up symptoms? At 4:40 p.m., my father was released from the hospital and told to get some rest at home. By 6 that evening, my mother was in the kitchen with Nikki, holding Shani as she cooked potato pancakes for our dinner. I sat at the dining room table adding colors to the black and white clown in my coloring book. I was months away from my 4th birthday. I heard my father coming down the stairs. His steps were slower than usual. I got up from the chair so I could be picked up as soon as he reached the first floor. Then I heard a crash. His body was sprawled and writhing at the foot of the stairs. Hardly any sounds came from his mouth. I heard another crash, this one from the kitchen. The clatter momentarily stole my attention from my father. My mother heard his collapse and, in her rush to see what had happened, dropped the sizzling cast iron skillet and potato pancakes on the floor. I looked back up to my father and saw him gasping for air, holding his throat. His normally strong features sagged in exhaustion, as if he were doing the final hours of battle that he had been fighting for years. I stared at him, looking but doing nothing. Mommy pushed past me and told Nikki to call 911. Nikki rushed to the phone and began speaking with the emergency personnel on the other end. I could hear her repeating again and again, "I don't know what county we're in." Minutes passed. Shani was crying hysterically. My mother attended to my father, improvising her own version of CPR while also minding Shani. My baby sister's screams only seemed to get louder, and I just stood there staring. Finally, my mother told me to go outside with Nikki and guide the ambulance crew in. My older sister took my hand and led me out to wait. Minutes later, police and the ambulance crews arrived. Nikki ordered me to stay outside while she led them into our home. At this point, my memories get less distinct. It was like standing in a field when a powerful gust of wind suddenly blows and everything around you vanishes. All you hear is the wind filling up your ears. All you feel is the wind on your skin. Your eyes tear and the sight blurs. Your mind all but empties. I stayed outside with the collection of neighbors who had come to see what was going on. Through my uncertain eyes, I saw my friend Ayana holding her mother's hand. When Ayana caught my eye, I could see that she was trying to force a smile, but all she got out was a look of uneasy confusion, which I mirrored back to her. The ambulance crew loaded my father into the gurney and raced back out. By this point, dozens of people lined the street. They watched as he was placed in the back of the ambulance. The doors slammed shut behind him. The loud sirens and flashing lights broke the silence of the neighborhood. Mommy quickly loaded us into the car and followed the ambulance to the hospital. The car was full of sound, Shani crying and Nikki making goo-goo noises to try to calm her down, and the roar of the ambulance in front of us. But it just felt as silent as a tomb. No talking, no questions, just the white noise of the ambulance. One sister crying, the other struggling to comfort her without words. The hospital was only 5 minutes from where we lived, but it seemed like a long ride. We rushed out of the car and ran inside. They were already working on my father, so we were sent to the waiting area. Shani had quieted down and was playing with her shoestrings, while Nikki put me in her lap. My paternal grandfather and my aunts, Dawn, Taiwana, and Evelyn, had all arrived to join our vigil. Eventually, an ER doctor walked into the waiting room. He asked to see my mother alone. "He's dead, isn't he?" my mother said before he could begin speaking. "I'm sorry, but by the time he got here, he was gone," the doctor said. We tried hard. I'm so sorry." Then my mother passed out. My father was dead 5 hours after having been released from the hospital with the simple instructions to go get some sleep. The same hospital was now preparing to send his body to the morgue. My father had entered the hospital seeking help, but his face was unshaven, his clothes disheveled, his name unfamiliar, his address not in an affluent area. The hospital looked at him askance, insulted him with ridiculous questions, and basically told him to fend for himself. Now my mother had to plan his funeral. He died on a Friday night. We were told at first that the hospital wouldn't be able to determine the cause of death until Monday, when they would perform the autopsy. But my father's radio station wanted to issue a news release about his death, so it leaned on the morgue to perform an autopsy sooner. The morgue acquiesced, and by Saturday afternoon, we found out that he had died from acute epiglottis, a rare but treatable virus that causes the epiglottis to swell and cover the air passages to the lungs. Untreated because of the earlier misdiagnosis, my father's body suffocated itself. Nikki took his death worse than the rest of us. Not just because she was the only one old enough to really understand what was going on, but because her biological father, Bill, changed abruptly after my father died. While my dad was alive, Bill supported Nikki financially and took the time to see her. After my father died, Bill no longer called, wrote, or bothered to check up on her. My father's love of Nikki had forced Bill to step up to his parenting responsibilities. It was almost as if Bill cared more because another man did. With my father no longer in the picture, the pressure was off. It was as if my sister lost two fathers that day. While I knew something bad had happened, I still wasn't sure what it meant. All weekend, people came in waves to our home. The phone rang nonstop. I saw the hurt on people's faces, but didn't fully understand it. I was still in the wind tunnel. I heard that my father had passed on, but had no idea where he'd gone. At the funeral, my Uncle Vin escorted us to the mahogany casket in the front of the church to have our final viewing of the body. The celebration of my father's life took place at the 14th Street Baptist Church, the same church my parents had been married in 6 years earlier. We stood in the front of my father's body for the final time. He lay in the casket with his eyes closed. It was the first time I had seen him in days. He looked more serene than he had appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at peace. I was holding my Uncle Vin's hand when I looked into the casket and asked my father, "Daddy, are you going to come home with us?"